In this video, I want to give you an overview of all the things to do with armatures. We'll get stuck into deeper and get our hands dirty, so to speak, later in the course, like learning to use constraints and how to connect your armature to your mesh, etc. But first, what is the anatomy of an armature? An armature object is a container for one thing, bones. Here's one now. Bones can actually be displayed in many different ways: octahedral, stick, E-bone, envelope, and wire. Plus, you can also make a bone take on any custom shape that you want. But here it is in its default state. Doesn't it look beautiful? Now, every bone has three parts. It has a head, a tail, and this middle section, which is not officially named, but I'm going to call it the body. These three things are considered one bone in Blender, whereas in some other software it's considered three objects. We have a joint, and the middle bit is a bone. Now the reason I mention this is for this case. What if we have a connected set of bones like this, where the head and the joint of the bones is connected to the tail of the parent? In other software, you would only have one joint in the middle here, but in Blender you have a head and a tail in the same place. This is true if it's a connected parent or an offset parent, which we'll learn about later, but every bone has a head and a tail, even if they're on top of each other. Now a bone will pivot around its head like this. It also has its own axes, which shows the orientation inside the armature container. Now, even though the widget here displays on the tail of the bone, you actually really should think about it as being placed on the head of the bone, because that is really where the pivot point of the bone is. It's also important to know that the length of the bone will always be the y-axis, and the x and the z-axis are dependent on what's called the bone's roll. I'll show you more about this later. So when we're building an armature in edit mode, we're thinking about the bones as having a bone roll. Anyway, let's jump into Blender and take a look at some important settings and where to find them. When you add an armature to your scene, it's always going to place it at this 3D cursor location. So I'm going to say it's actually a necessity to put it at 0, 0, 0, or world space at the center of the origin, because it's just going to save you a lot of headaches down the road. So I'm going to snap this back to the world origin by hitting Shift S and then choosing world origin. So there we go, my cursor is back at 0, 0, 0. Then I'm going to add an armature with Shift A, and then I'm going to choose armature, single bone. Now I have extra options here because I have certain add-ons enabled, but you'll probably only have this one. Don't worry about that, just choose this one for now. So there we go, we've added our armature object. You can see it's added up here in the outliner. You can see we have the armature object and we have actually the armature data name. So these are the names here, I'll go over those in just a moment. So when you're dealing with armatures, they actually have different modes. So different objects inside 3D have their own set of modes that go with them. So with this one, we have object mode, we have edit mode, and we have pose mode. So object mode is for positioning around the whole armature object or container. But when we do rigging, as I mentioned, we always want that to be at the world origin. So I'm just going to undo that to make sure that we're back where we want it to be. Now edit mode is where we edit and add new bones to our armature. We'll be going over the specifics of that later in the course. Now pose mode actually has two uses. When you're doing rigging, this is where we actually add all our constraints to make the bones do exactly what we want them to do. But when you're animating, this is also where you add your beautiful animation to your armature, or your terrible animation, depending on what type of animator you are. Now to jump between modes, we can just hit the tab key, and because I've enabled my user preferences for swapping the control tab for tab, I get my pie menu for the different object modes here. So we've got object mode, we've got pose mode, and we've got edit mode. Now if you have the default settings for Blender, to bring up the pie menu, we need to use control tab rather than tab, as I've done in this example. Now also with the three different modes here, you've actually got different color shading on our armature. So when we're in object mode, kind of the whole thing is this kind of particular orange color. When we're in edit mode, you can see that just selectively. We've got the bones that are more yellowish, and then when we go to pose mode, you see that the bones actually are shaded in blue. Now you'll get to learn the differences between the modes just visually by that. So you've got orange for object mode, yellow for edit mode, blue for pose mode. Now in this lesson, I'm just going to go over some useful settings that we'll find on for our armature objects inside the object tab as well as the data tab. This is the armature data tab. Here's the bone data tab and some constraints and stuff like that. But I'll just point out a few things and go over what we really need to know. We don't need to go through everything. Here inside our object tab, we've actually got our transform. So this is the transformation, like the position and the rotation and the scale of our object here. So if I bring up the N key, it's the same thing as up here. Now remember, as I've said twice already, we want this to be at 0, 0, 0. We don't want it to have any rotation, but we do want the scale to be at 1. This is going to make rigging a lot easier. And it's a really good habit to get into to make sure that these are 0, 0, and 1s down here. So this is just a mirror version of that over here. So in our viewport display here, we've got our show name and show axes. So what that's done is it's just displaying the name of the armature as well as the axes for our armature object, the whole entire container. You shouldn't really need to have those ones on, just as long as we know that we've got 0 rotations and locations, and we're at a scale of 1. Now, those ones are more useful at the bone level rather than the actual armature level, which we'll go over shortly. So this in front is actually going to display it over the front of any other object. So when we enable in front, we'll be able to see our armature on top of any of the other geometry. It won't be occluded by it. So this bone is actually inside, but we can see it. Now, this in front option here is also exactly the same inside our armature data tab. We've got the same option down here. I would say you're probably going to use it in this tab more often than the object tab, but it's just replicated in two different spots on purpose. So the last thing I want to show you in this tab is the display as. So this is set to textured by default, but if we change this to wire, you actually now see the outline of our armature here. Although when we're in object mode, you can just see the outline of the whole entire thing. But if we jump into pose mode or edit mode, it looks very similar. You can actually see through, and I've gone ahead and placed the hidden bone on the middle there. But if we change this back to textured, you can't actually see that hidden bone in the middle there. So you can do a similar thing with the X-ray feature up here. So we hit this button up here, or if we hit the Alt-Z, that's the keyboard shortcut, you actually now see through our geometry. It's changed the opacity of our geometry, which is sometimes handy. But sometimes you actually do need to see the full opacity of the geometry, so that's where you would disable that and then make sure that you turn the wire on. So now you can see the full opacity of geometry, but you can also see through your bones here. Alright, so the final thing I want to show you is actually the thing that's right up the top here. So this is actually the name of our object. We can change it up here by clicking and changing it to whatever we want. Let's just call it new name. Or we could just double click up here in the outliner and type newer name. Or inside our 3D viewport, if we push F2 when we're in object mode, we can then change it even newer name. I think it's really handy just to hit the F2 in the 3D viewport. Now, moving on to the data tab, I'll start with this name up here. This is the name for our data block. So you can see our object name is even newer name, but our armature data is still called armature. Now, it's always a good idea to keep these in sync or name your data, so that if you ever need to import the data or connect it to another object, it's got the same name and you know what is what. It's just a really good habit to get into naming your objects as well as the data. So we always want to keep it the same. So let's just go copy that. Now, to change that, we can just click in here and paste it if we want, or we could just click in here and change the name of the data if we want. So this is the data name. Sadly, we can't push F2 inside here and change the data. We can for the bones, I'll show you in a moment, but we can't do it for the actual armature data. So under this skeleton tab here, we have a few handy features. We've got the pose position and we've got the rest position. And you'll learn more about the differences later on, but I'm going to jump into pose mode and then just position this bone over here. So now I have some transforms on our bone, meaning I have moved away from its default rest position. The bone is now posed. However, if I enable rest position here, it will ignore that and jump back to where I placed it in edit mode. Sometimes a constraint will actually shift the bone away from where you placed it in edit mode, and this will ignore that too. It's going to show you where you put all those bones in edit mode. And you also notice if I try and grab this and move it around, I get a warning there. It says you cannot change pose when rest position is enabled. So if you ever get that warning from someone else's rig that you may have downloaded, just make sure that you turn it back onto pose position, and then you can move it around and add constraints and see what's actually going on with your rig. So underneath that section, we have our layers here. And this is 32 predefined layers that we can place all of our bones on. So I just went ahead and created 5 bones, and I put one bone on each of the layers. You can tell that the layers are active because of this blue colored in section. The circles mean that there is something on that layer, even though it may or may not be visible. But the colored in dot shows you which bone is active. Even though you might have more than one bone selected, it's just showing you what layer the active bone is on. So if we just single click on each one of these layers, you should see what I mean. It hasn't deleted any of the other bones that I've placed there. It's just hiding the visibility. So if I actually want to show more than one layer, you just hold down the shift key when you click, and you can show whatever layers that you want there. If I choose one of these layers, there's nothing on it, so you can't actually see. You can also click and drag. So I'm just dragging my mouse there, and you can see that I've enabled all the layers. The one thing that you might find yourself doing is holding down the shift and just going rup to turn all of your layers on. That's often something that I do, just to turn everything on when I want to see everything. It also works in reverse, so if you want to disable anything, just click and drag. Although you can't turn off all of your layers, at least one needs to be visible. Alright, so let's turn these all on and talk about moving them. So you can move them in pose mode or edit mode. It doesn't matter, that works exactly the same. If we hit the M key, M for move, you can actually just move the selected bones to whatever layer that you want. So now you see that it equals active and it's on this layer here, which is no longer visible. You can actually make it display on more than one layer, so hit M again. Then I hold down the shift key when I click this, and then you can see that I've enabled that all over there. That confirms when you move your mouse away from that little pop-up menu. What is best practice when you're using the layers here? Well, it's best practice to put your control bones, which we'll learn about later on the same layer. So similar controls on the same layers. So for example, all your leg controls might be on one layer, all your torso controls on another, all your right arm on one layer, left arm on the other layer, etc. And you may also put all of your deformation and mechanism bones on a specific layer over here, where the animator will never see. You'll learn more about that later on. Now, protected layers are a little bit outside the scope of this course. They're actually used for linking in your character to another scene, or linking your rig rather to another scene. And the protected layer will make sure that the animator cannot edit or add any of the constraints to your rig, which sounds like a good idea, but it actually has some other downfalls to the way it's designed at the moment. So I won't go into more detail on that, because in the future, both of the layers and the protected layer system is going to be redesigned. So I'm looking forward to explaining that in the future. So moving down here, we're going to jump into pose mode and then show you how bone groups work. So we can actually just click and add as many groups as we want, give it a new name, so a new name, and then we can assign bones to this group. I'm just going to select these 2 bones, just for an example. I'm going to assign it to this group called new name. And what has that done? Well, we can select and deselect them if we wanted to, so I can select all those ones, which is not really how I use this system. The main reason I use this system is to give them bone colors. And when we combine this with custom shapes, which I'll show you later in the course, it can actually color code your rig and make it really easy for the animators to use. So that's what that is there. So you've got, with this color themes, you've got a list of predefined colors, or you can choose your own custom color set, and then you can click on here and just change it to be whatever you want. So maybe we want that one to be this color, for example. And I'm really good at languages. So the first color is for when that bone is unselected, or its regular color. The middle color is what will be shown when it is selected, and the third color is what will be shown when it is the active bone. And remember, only one bone can be active at a time. Now let's take a look at viewport displays. So remember, we're still on the armature level. We can change the way our bones display. We're in octahedral at the moment. We can change it to stick, we can change it to big bone, we can change it to envelope, or we can change it to wire, which is really, really thin. The ones that I use the most would be the big bones, because they show you the bone segments, and you can actually scale them up with Control-Alt-S, and we're actually just changing the way it's visually displayed. It's not actually changing anything under the hood or changing the thickness of the bone or anything like that. It's just the way that it looks. We'll go over the envelope display when we talk about weight painting, as those envelopes you see are essentially the fall-off area that will move your verts of your mesh. You probably won't actually use this feature all that often, as most of the time you won't be able to achieve the correct deformation you need, and you actually have to use a weight group for the actual deformation, which we'll cover later. Alright, so here under the viewport settings, we can display the names of our bones, and we can also show the axes. When you're new to rigging, I think you'll find the name very, very handy, so you can actually see what bone that we're dealing with. Once you get used to it, it's probably going to be in your way, so I don't have that enabled. One thing that I do toggle on and off quite often is the axes, because this shows you the individual axes for our bones, which is very handy and needed when we're rigging, because we need to know which way things are pointing. Now the shapes will enable or disable any custom bone shapes that you've added. We haven't got any at the moment, but we'll look at that later. And the colors, this will enable or disable the bone group colors that we just set up a moment ago. Right, now jumping over to our bone tab. So right at the top here, we have our bone name. So we can rename our bone by clicking in here, or you might find it a little bit easier. If you're in edit mode or pose mode, you can actually just hit F2 inside our thing here and give this one a new name. And if I turn on my bone names, which I should have done before, you can see that that has changed the name there. So I'll just show you that also works in edit mode. If I hit F2, that's changing the bone name. And you can actually see the icon here is a bone, so we know that we're renaming the bone. So this is bone 03. Now those of you who have a keen eye would notice that there's a different number of tabs available when you're in pose mode and when you're in edit mode. That is because not all of those settings are applicable to all the modes. For example, the bone constraints tab will only show in pose mode, because that's the mode where you set your bone constraints. A lot of these settings are displayed in both modes, but not all. So Blender will change the display and only show you the applicable things in a specific mode. And this might be a little bit tricky when you first start out. You'll be going, hey, where did that setting go? But before too long, it will become second nature, so don't worry and hang in there. Right, so let's jump up here. We are in edit mode at the moment, so our transforms up here, also our transforms up here in our item tab, show me our transforms on our head and our tail. So if I move this here, you'll see it's actually moving in the 3D viewport, and it's also, those changes are reflecting the changes up here. So this would be one way to edit or position the bones, but I wouldn't recommend it. But it can help you diagnose the problem. So you might actually be, oh, this should be 0, so then you just type in 0. So that's one way to diagnose a problem or an error when you're rigging, is to actually see the values here. Down here we have our bendy bones. Most of this will be grayed out unless you have the segments value of more than 1. So I'll just slide it up to 4. Now nothing is changing in our actual viewport, but when we go over and change our display to big bone, you can see all the segments here. And when I change that, you can see it updating in the viewport. Now bendy bones will only display in B-bone mode display. There's much more to learn about these awesome bones, but we'll be covering that in its own dedicated video later on. So let's jump ahead for now. So under relations here, you can see what bone layer these are on, so we can actually change it if we want down here. That's another way of changing it. You can see our parent bone here, although we can't edit anything in pose mode, we can only edit this when we're in edit mode. So if I wanted to reparent here, we can click in here and change our parent to be the bone, so you can see we've got a relationship line showing that we are now connected to this bone over here. If I want to remove that, we can click that. We'll go more in depth about this later. Now, our deform tab shows you whether it is enabled or disabled for that particular bone. Now, by default, when you add a bone, every bone is set to deform. So we actually need to disable this for all our bones that are not going to be used to deform our mesh. It's always good practice to get into that habit, but as I said about 12,000 times, we'll learn more about that later. So that's a general overview of some of the key things about armatures and where to find certain settings. In the next couple of lessons, we'll actually dive in deeper and learn about all those things that I said we learn about later.